In 1936, the foundation fulfilled pledges totaling roughly $655,000 to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. This figure is important because online stories sometimes transform it into $650 million. There is no reliable evidence that Rockefeller spent $650 million financing Hitler. The documented figure is roughly $655,000, not $650 million. And even that money was not a personal payment to Hitler. It was institutional and scientific funding. But that does not make the story insignificant. Welcome to Xfinity Evolution, where history comes alive and legends are reborn. Imagine discovering that one of America's most powerful philanthropic organizations was sending money to German scientists during the years when Adolf Hitler was rising to power. At first glance, it sounds like a direct financial connection between Rockefeller and Hitler. But the real story is more complicated, and in some ways more disturbing. Because the money was not simply handed to Hitler. It was used to support scientific institutions and researchers in Germany, including areas of research that would later become deeply connected with Nazi racial ideology. And the question is not simply, did Rockefeller fund Hitler? The more important question is, what did Rockefeller money help build, and what happened to that research after the Nazis took power? To understand the story, we have to go back to Germany before Hitler controlled the country. During the 1920s, Germany remained one of the world's great centers of science, medicine, mathematics, and academic research. But German science was struggling financially after the First World War. The Rockefeller Foundation began supporting scientific and medical research around the world, and Germany became one of the places where that money flowed. The foundation supported institutions connected to the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, a major network of German research institutes. Among the areas receiving support was research into human heredity and eugenics. At the time, eugenics was promoted by some scientists in several countries as a way to supposedly improve humanity through selective reproduction. Today, these ideas are associated with some of the darkest chapters in modern history. One researcher connected to this field was Ernst Rudin. Rudin later became an important figure in Nazi racial hygiene policies and supported compulsory sterilization. Then came 1933. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within months, Germany's political system was transformed into a dictatorship. Jewish scientists were dismissed. Academic freedom was crushed. And research institutions were increasingly brought into line with Nazi ideology. But Rockefeller funding did not immediately disappear. In 1936, the foundation fulfilled pledges totaling roughly $655,000 to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. This figure is important because online stories sometimes transform it into $650 million. There is no reliable evidence that Rockefeller spent $650 million financing Hitler. The documented figure is roughly $655,000, not $650 million. And even that money was not a personal payment to Hitler. It was institutional and scientific funding. But that does not make the story insignificant. Because the research environment being supported was becoming increasingly entangled with Nazi racial policies. Scientists studied genetics, racial characteristics, mental illness, and heredity. Some of these fields were later incorporated into the Nazi state's campaign of forced sterilization and racial persecution. One of the darker connections involves Joseph Mengele, who later became infamous for his experiments at Auschwitz. Before Auschwitz, Mengele worked with geneticist Ottmar von Verschuer, a prominent figure in German heredity research. Rockefeller funding had supported parts of the German scientific network in which this research developed. However, there is an essential distinction. There is no evidence that Rockefeller executives secretly financed Mengele's Auschwitz experiments. The foundation's funding for the relevant research ended before the worst years of the Holocaust. And there is no credible evidence that John D. Rockefeller personally ordered or financed Hitler's rise to power. So what does the evidence actually tell us? It tells us something more complicated than a conspiracy headline. American philanthropy helped strengthen German scientific institutions before and during the early years of Nazi rule. Some researchers and institutions supported by that scientific system later became involved in Nazi racial science. But Rockefeller also helped scientists who were being persecuted by the Nazis. As Jewish and other scholars were forced out of German universities, Rockefeller-backed programs helped relocate endangered academics. So the same foundation that had previously supported German scientific institutions also helped rescue scientists from the regime that later corrupted parts of that scientific system. And that contradiction is at the heart of this story. Rockefeller wasn't simply funding Hitler. It was an international scientific relationship operating during one of the most dangerous political transformations in modern history. The foundation believed scientific research could remain valuable even when politics changed. But Nazi Germany demonstrated how dangerous that assumption could become. Science does not exist in a vacuum. Research can be used to heal. It can be used to understand. And it can also be twisted into an ideological weapon. The Rockefeller story therefore raises a much bigger question than money. When does supporting science become supporting the system around it? The historical record does not show Rockefeller handing Hitler a fortune. It shows a complicated relationship between American philanthropy, German science, eugenics, and a regime that would ultimately turn racial ideology into one of history's greatest catastrophes. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: money can fund research. But once knowledge enters the world, no donor can completely control what humanity does with it. If you want to understand how history is unfolding before our eyes, don't miss what comes next. Revisit Xfinity Evolution for deeper insights and powerful stories. Stay informed, stay curious, and join us again on Xfinity Evolution, where the world's biggest events come into focus.